Okay, I'll start probably with my experience. So when I was young, I went through a lot of trauma, and there was a lot of things I couldn't control that were happening in my life. And it kind of got to the point where I was trying to use substances to sort of make myself feel better and also punish myself at the same time. So, I was drinking a lot of alcohol, I was taking pain medication, and obviously this got me in really bad straits really quickly. It was sort of to the point where I hit rock bottom and I was like, okay, I need some help. I ended up in hospital, and it was great because I kind of saw my very first experience with vicarious hope through peer work. I was around all these people who were, like me, going through something really, really hard, but they were getting up every day and they were fighting to make it, and they were fighting to keep going. And that was really inspiring to me. So I kind of, obviously being in the hospital, I was clean of everything. So when I got out, I didn't really, I learned some coping mechanisms, but I kind of flailed, I was lost. And I ended up sort of, I lived in a halfway house, and a bunch of us, we were trying to be social but not engage in the behaviors we used to engage in. So we went to the casino. But that became a replacement and then an accessory to the same kind of self-destructive spiraling behaviors. And yeah, my story is kind of punctuated with, attempts at suicide, and then weird, slow, drawn out, let's hope I die from this types of behavior. And I wish I had a nicer way to put it, but that's sort of what it was. And it would get to the point where, we'd spend 2 or 3 days at a time at the casino. And, you'd spend the rent, and then you'd have to try and get it back. And you couldn't go home till you had the bare minimum. So it was a really, really hopeless time. And it was sort of, whenever I'd win anything, it was sort of like, yay, a little spike of hope, a little piece of joy, but it wouldn't last very long. But every time I'd lose, it would help reinforce to me every negative thing I ever thought about myself. And yeah, as I say, the whole journey was punctuated with attempts, and I am so grateful that every single one failed. Yeah. As I say, things happened, hit rock bottom, and ended up back in hospital. And it was the best thing that could have happened, because I was in there for 3 months at that point. It was a, extended stay. And just like the first time, I got to see little glimmers of peer work. I got to see the power that we have when we connect with each other. And that changed my life. And that transformed it for me. I wanted to be that little kernel of hope that other people feel. And I wanted to help other people see that we can keep going and it can get better. And yeah, I've been engaged in peer work in some way or another for the last 13, 14 years because of that. So I'm part of 2 distinct communities, and I think, honestly, we're probably more statistically prone to suicide. So I'm part of the disabled community, and I'm part of the LGBTQIA+ community. And I think with both, the way we deal with suicidality is kind of the same. It's community, it's collaboration, it's connection. It's standing side by side with each other and holding each other up when we don't have anything left to give, when we can't keep going. We sit next to each other in the discomfort, and we hold that space for each other. And we do whatever we can to pull each other through it. And we take turns. And that's, again, one of the beautiful things that I find about peer work and using lived experience to help each other. yeah, every single time I've had dark days, it has been those people I could connect with and share lived experiences with, other disabled people, other people in the LGBTQ plus community. It's always other people who've been marginalized and who have been put down and who feel othered in some way, you know? And I don't think people talk enough about the physical and emotional pain that comes with that feeling othered. You know, it's all about empowering yourself and learning the tools. How much can we be expected to learn and grow and know and keep going when everything around us is telling us the opposite, you know? We live in a system where to have value isn't just to be. It should be, and, you know, it is really, but all of our worth is put into how productive we can be and how assimilated we can be and how masculine or feminine or whatever it is we're expected to be. And as someone who is disabled, my productivity is never going to be to the same level of someone who's able-bodied. And it's also never going to be the same as, you know, someone who's more disabled than me, you know. And I think we have to kind of abandon those expectations that everyone else has for us and come together and huddle in our little, this is our expectations for ourselves. This is what we can do and what we're good at and what's important to us. And I'm just hoping that, you know, as time goes on, the wider community can see and feel the value and worth in that too. So yeah, in Scotland, where I'm from, as a lot of people would know, they're light years ahead in terms of peer work. They've done some really powerful work with the frameworks and guidelines, and, you know, it's wonderful. However, that's all very recent, and it still is, it's sort of trying to combat this culture of you don't make your issues anybody else's problem. You use what you have around you to cope. That's why, you know, we have a lot of issues with use of alcohol, use of drugs, use of unhealthy food, use of sex, use of gambling. Everybody has their own sort of sin, their vice, because that is the only acceptable way of coping with your stress, your distress, your issues. And it's quite a powerful statement that in a country where that is and always has been the norm, where you make sure you survive on your own without help, that peer work is having such like a stunning, powerful development. And, you know, we are similar here in Australia, but it's just so more standalone, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, especially for men and masculine, you know, people. It's very much a, you go to work, you do your job, you provide, you protect, and you shut up about it. You know, there's an awful lot of that. And I know it's changing, and it's wonderful that it's changing. It's nice to see that two cultures, though they deal with it differently, are both kind of using the same remedy to improve the problem. I honestly feel like, and I know everybody says this, but I really feel like we need more resources, more funding, and we need the funding and resources to go towards peer-led community services. That's where it's needed. And, you know, depending on what area physically, geographically you're looking at, the needs are going to be different. You know, I'm from a place in southwest Sydney where there's poverty everywhere. And there is very little in terms of community services, especially led by peer workers. But you go, you know, 40 minutes north, and there is every service you could want with lots of availability. But there's, you know, financial barriers. And I just really hope that as a nation, we can try and find a way to, you know, make it more equal. Bring that equity that we really, really sorely need, because certain demographics are more affected by suicide and by suicidality and by mental health issues. And they are also often the demographics that will not reach out for help willingly. So we need to find a way to bridge the gap. And the best way I feel to bridge the gap is through community. And I think what we're doing here is really important. What we're doing nationally with lived experience-led research and development is really important. We need to figure out a way to apply it that's going to make sense for the communities involved.